Pennsylvania's Revolutionary War veterans. Just to start, it is a lot of information we're going to be going over in a short time, an hour. So I will be going fast. But if you have any questions, put them at the end. I'm here for you. I will stay as long as it takes to answer your questions that you have as we go through this. But before we really get started, I have to, let's see here. See if I can get this moving here. There we go. Plug the state archives. They said I am the public service section head at the Pennsylvania State Archives. For those of you who have never been to the archives, have heard about the Pennsylvania State Archives. We are the official repository of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Our mission is to acquire, preserve, and make available for study the historical public records of the Commonwealth. Right now, we estimate we have about 250 million plus pages of documents spanning 84 record groups, which are government collections, and 537 manuscript groups, which are kind of private papers. We are open to the public Wednesday, Thursday, Fridays, and the second Saturdays each month. So the public is welcome to come in, and there will always be archivists on staff to assist, and you can access some of the records we're talking about either on our computers or physically if they're not digitized or available any other way. Now, during the course of the presentation, I'm going to be mentioning several sites that you may or may not be familiar with. I figure most people are aware at least of Ancestry and Fold 3. Ancestry.com has a lot of these records available on their site, as does Fold 3, which is a product of Ancestry also. They are both subscription sites, but you can often access them through a local public library or a historical society. If you're familiar with the LDS Church and their family history centers, they oftentimes have access to it too. The lesser known websites that I'll be mentioning, at least most people have less knowledge of them, is one is Hathy Trust. Hathy Trust is kind of like a Google Books. They have digitized a lot of old volumes and books. The Pennsylvania Archives series is on there. They're a great source for a number of published books from the Pennsylvania government and other governments and other publications. Power Library, PA Power Library, I'll be mentioning that often. That is a state library of Pennsylvania product. There are a number of institutions that have a digital presence on there from across the state, including the Pennsylvania State Archives, where we have thousands of records that you can browse for free on there, including pretty much all the Revolutionary War records I talk about from our collection. If you've never used it before, you can certainly Google it, and you can navigate under the institutions to the Pennsylvania State Archives. I personally suggest going to our website. You can see kind of at the bottom of the page there, the pastatearchives.com, and then go under Research Online, Digital Collections, and Power Library. That will take you to the page that you see here, and then you can browse by department or subject, and we'll mention those departments as we go through. There's also a handout that I provided that will have all the sources and the indexes and notes to what websites that you can find those records, so you don't have to take all the notes as we go along. All right, so now we're through all that. Where do we begin on our search? We have heard, let's say that we have an ancestor that could have served in the Revolutionary War, or we come across an ancestor that was of the right age and we're just wondering if they did, or you came across a DIR application that said that this particular person in your family line served in the Revolutionary War, or was in Continental Line, or served with George Washington, or something along those lines. So we're interested in trying to find that PA veteran, and we want to know, how do we begin? Well, the first place to start is with personal information on that particular individual that you think may have served, or if you've heard rumors to have served. You're going to want to know as much as possible about that individual before diving into the military records at all. Just don't jump right in and start looking at particular documents or searching indexes without having basic information on that individual. Name, not only how you have it, think of different spellings. If the name has changed over time, the name of the individual, dates of birth and death. It doesn't have to be exact, but a year for each of those. residency, if they had wives, multiple wives, who they were, when, and children's names, as much information as possible. And you're going to get a lot of this information from non-military records. For Pennsylvania, it's largely going to be found in county records. Think of deed books, tax records, various court records, probate records, that you're going to want to explore to gain all this information. The ultimate goal is to create a very clear timeline for this individual from birth to death, knowing where they resided, when they, where they were, at what time, what family members were there. You need this detailed guideline before going into the military records, simply because most Revolutionary War military records are going to have very little personal information, identifying information for person, or it's very piecemeal. So if you come into your military search with as much information about that individual, you're going to have a greater chance of being able to identify the correct individuals. If you have an ancestor named John Smith, there's going to be a lot of John Smiths. You need to know a lot about your guy to be able to weed out the ones that aren't. So this is where you begin before even thinking about looking at any Revolutionary War records. Get as much detail, create that timeline for your ancestor before jumping in. The next thing you need to really know, or at least wrap your head around, after you gain that information, is the fact that there's multiple, I refer to as military branches in the Revolutionary War. The reason I like to note this is you might find a record, or you might have a reference in one of your genealogies, or you find in a published history somewhere that the individual served in the 1st Battalion during the Revolutionary War from Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania 1st Battalion, or something along those lines. Well, a lot of these different units use very similar unit designations. And without knowing if it's the militia, is it the Continental Line, you're going to be going down the wrong path. You don't necessarily need to know a lot about these branches to start out with, but know that there are different branches that you may be dealing with. The person could serve in multiple ones, or they might only serve in one. For Pennsylvania, most individuals that served as part of the militia. And we'll go into more detail a little bit later on why that's the case. But knowing the fact that there's multiple branches that a PA veteran could have served in will help in interpreting the records, or knowing why you're not finding something in one group of records that you need to look somewhere else in the military records. So that's really how you want to begin. Information on the individual, and know the fact that there's going to be multiple different branches that you may need to think about while you're doing your search. With all that information gathered, you can move on to the indexes. And fortunately enough, Revolutionary War is very popular, so there's a lot of indexes out there. And some of these indexes really serve as a substitute for actual original records in the start of your search. But there is a lot, and they cover all the branches that you looked at. Now, there's two major ones dealing with Pennsylvania. The first and foremost one that you should start with in Pennsylvania for any Pennsylvania veterans is the Revolutionary War military abstract cards. These are 3x5 cards that serve as an index to the collections at the Pennsylvania State Archives. They are arranged alphabetically, and they're the most comprehensive index that we have. Now, the information on them are drawn or abstracted from the original records that we have in our collection. So if you find a card, that means that we physically have that record in our holdings. It covers all the branches: Continental Line, militia, associators, flying, camp, Navy, everything within our collection. All the branches are captured in these cards. And you know that there is a record that goes with it. Now, I said it's the most comprehensive, but there are some caveats that you need to consider when looking at these cards. One is they did not create a card for every single document that person appears in for that unit. This project to create these cards was started in the 1960s, and to speed up the process, instead of doing a card for every single entry that individual appears, they typically did a single card for a particular unit for a particular type of record. So if they were in the Lancaster County Militia and they appear on a class roll or some type of roll, a roster, they'll create a card for that. It has the unit, has the date range, it has what the type of record is on it. If that same person is found in the same unit but in find list, they'll create another card for the find list for that individual. But they didn't do, there could be 20 find lists or 20 roles with that person's name on it for that unit. They did not do a card for every single time that person appeared. It's kind of just a kind of a bookmark saying there's a person by this name in this unit. So just keep that in mind when looking at these cards. But it is the best index to what we have in our collection. And when I do researches for people at the archives, I start with this to begin with. It is available online. It's on ancestry.com under the veterans card file, 1775 to 1916. So you can browse it on there and see if you can find it. The next major index is the Revolutionary War compiled service records. These are indexes to the Revolutionary War rolls and numbered books at the National Archives. These serve a similar purpose to our cards. The only difference is they did do a card for every time that person appeared in the records. And they also group them by the individual. So you have a single individual with multiple cards in it. Ours are just alphabetical order. But these cards contain abstracted information from largely the Revolutionary War rolls at the National Archives. Most of what the National Archive has are the Continental Line records. So most of these cards are going to be dealing with Continental Line, very little militia with some associated units mixed in. They are available on Ancestry and fold3.com. I believe Family Search has it's searchable, but I don't believe you can view the images of the cards at all. But the cards themselves are kind of a surrogate to the originals because they have pretty much all the information abstracted on there. And it's kind of a low-hanging fruit that you can look at real quick. Other indexes that you can use, one is the Pennsylvania Archives. This is the Published Pennsylvania Archives series. Specifically, 5th and 6th series are the best series to use. The Pennsylvania Archive series, if you've ever looked at DAR, if you ever looked at SAR, it's Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution, and other sources, especially from the early 20th century all the way up to the mid 20th century, almost all their applications cite the Published Pennsylvania Archives for Pennsylvania veterans. The published series contains abstracts, transcriptions of original records from our collection and from other repositories that they transcribed and published in the 5th and 6th series. Not all of the documents or records that they have in those volumes are real documents. And what I mean by that is they sometimes hold names from various records to create kind of like an artificial roster for a unit. So that's something to keep in mind when looking at it, at the records you find in the 5th and 6th series. However, it is a good source to identify a unit and a person within a particular unit at a given time. It's, again, something that's easily searched, something that's available on multiple sites and for free. It's on Ancestry, it's on Fold3. Hathy Trust has all these series available online for free. And both series are indexed, or you can just search them because they're digitized to find an individual. So again, it's a good place to start out, although, like I said, it's one of those sources, it's a secondary source where you have to question whether it's completely accurate, and also you have to do a little bit of studying to figure out where that record might be located outside there. But a good source to, again, build up the name list of individuals that could be your ancestor in the units that they served in. Now, if you had individuals that served as officers, there are several other indexes that you can use separate from those other ones, which also captured officers. But you have Heitman's Historical Register of Officers. This volume contains the names of officers, alphabetical order of largely Continental Line and associator units. It doesn't cover Pennsylvania militia. But if it was an officer in the Continental Line, it's a good place to start because they do provide basic information as to what unit and when they were commissioned. So it gives you some of that basic information that you can start before moving to the original records. Um, it's available everywhere. You just Google the title. Multiple sites have it. It's a volume that's everywhere. Again, making it very easy to kind of browse real quick if you know you have an officer. There are some caveats. There are a lot of inaccuracies in his book. Um, but again, it's a place to start. It's an index. It gives you names. It gives it units. It gives you rough time periods when they served in those units and ranks to get you started, so you can proceed into the original records or eliminate individuals. There's also one for those that served in the Navy and the Marine Corps. Although there's not many Pennsylvanians that served in the Navy, the Continental Navy, or the Marine Corps. And I can honestly tell you there's not many officers that are listed in these registers either. I think there's maybe 2 pages and that's it. The Continental Navy wasn't very large. But if there's the rumor is, or if you heard stories that your ancestor was part of the Continental Navy and an officer, this is certainly a book to look at to get, again, a date of appointment, the name, or just to verify whether that's true or not. Um, and again, this one's available on multiple sites online just by Googling it, pulling it up. All right, so you look through the indexes and you're going to get a lot of names. You're going to get some unit information, but it's going to be very difficult in doing this research to try and identify who is your actual ancestors. And it's much harder if it's a unique name. It's not a unique name. If it's John Smith, John Brown, you're going to have a number of different units where John Brown is listed in. And from most of these indexes, you may not have an idea of which one's yours, which ones can be eliminated. Um, and that's the case when I do research for folks. You know, I'll go through, get a list of all the names that match whatever information I have on the person, whether it's just name or if it's a particular county, if you know if he's part of the militia or could be a militia, Wright County. I get all of those units listed out. If I'm lucky, there's only one or two, and it doesn't take long to eliminate. But if there's many of them, you need to start whittling down and eliminating ones that could not be your ancestor. And while most may go to the military service records to try and find that, I like to start with pension records. The reason why I go right from the indexes to the pension records is that it's one of the few military-related records where you're going to oftentimes get a lot of personal information on the veteran, enough information that you could eliminate or verify that this is my person. And it's a low-hanging fruit. Again, it's one of those records that's available online elsewhere. It's easily searched that you can start eliminating or verifying that it's your ancestor or not. So I always go right then to the pension records to see if I can proceed any further, eliminate or narrow the list that I'm looking at. Now, there's federal and state pensions, and a veteran could apply for both. I usually start with the federal pension records, which are at the National Archives, and they're under the title U.S. Revolutionary War Pensions and Bounty Land Warrant Application Files. So it includes both pension and bounty land, federal bounty land applications are all filed together. I like using the federal pension records first because of the two, of the state and federal is much, much more likely to have the applications and supporting documents related to that pension request. Whether it's granted or not, they're likely going to have an application or supporting documents there. And those supporting documents are wonderful. There's no need for an index to these records. They're arranged alphabetical. And you can go on to Ancestry, you can go on Fold 3, you can pull them up and browse through them, or you can simply search by name and take a look. But there's a wealth of information that you can find in there. You can find, certainly you most likely are going to find unit. You're going to possibly get a date of birth for the person, where they resided and when. Oftentimes it's where they resided when they enlisted and then where they were when applying for a pension. You might get family member names, wife, children. It can just be a wealth of information. And again, it's one of those where it will provide enough information that I can say, yes, it is my ancestor, or no, this John Doe in this unit is not my ancestor. Check him off. I don't have to look at those unit records. Um, the one thing that I have a caveat about is, or something that you should keep in mind when you're looking through these, is a lot of the veterans and were quite old when they got pensions. You're looking about 1820s, 1830s if they lived that long. Um, so they're up there in age. So their memory might be gone a little bit. They might get captains' names wrong. They might have dates wrong. So take that with a grain of salt when you're going through them. And just like with anything, just like a fishing trip, that small fish gets bigger and bigger over the years. Some of these veterans do exaggerate a bit on their applications. Sometimes there's motivation to try and pad the application. Other times it's just simply memory. I've come across several where they said that they were part of a particular unit, which they were, but then they claimed to be at all these different battles and such, and um, they couldn't have been at those places. So look at it. You can get a lot of identifying information. And then again, you still need to go to the original records to verify some of the claims in there, but at least you could be certain if it's your ancestor or not that was part of that unit and go forward. Now, like I said, the state also had pension records. The only problem with the state pensions is very few applications and supporting documents exist. They just don't seem to have been kept. They could have been lost over the years. I don't really have a good answer to what happened to all those. If you look at the minutes of the state General Assembly, it notes all the time that applications, supporting documents are submitted. They just don't seem to, or most don't seem to have survived over the years. What you typically have for state pensions are pension ledgers, which you can see in this image here. It'll document the individual. It'll say where they were residing at the time when they were granted the pension, how much they were getting, what year the special act was passed. For state pensions, they were granted the pension through a special act of the legislature. And then it lists all the payments that were made, whether the person is now dead. Sometimes it has the date of death on there too. Again, it can help identify or differentiate between individuals in that case. And then if the wife ever picked up, she would have entries in the pension ledger too. But that's the bulk of the state pensions. That's not to say that there aren't some records and supporting documents that do exist. So it's always still worth a shot at taking a look at them. Now, the pension ledgers for the state are scattered among a number of record groups or collections at the Pennsylvania State Archives, and it's largely because of who handled what and when. Like you have the Auditor General, they have a lot of the pension ledgers because they handled basically the reconciling of the payments being made. You have the Comptroller General, which is Record Group 4. They did the same thing until the Auditor General was created. And then you have the General Assembly, which actually granted the special acts. So you have a lot of bills granting special acts for pension. And then every now and then the Supreme Court, got involved with some pensions. So there's some scattered in there. Fortunately, there is an index that covers all of those, and it's on our webpage. So you can go in, type in a name, or browse by a first letter of the name to see if there's any type of entry for your ancestor. Just keep in mind the vast majority of them are going to be a reference to a volume, which is just a pension ledger on it. These are all available online, the index and the original records. They're all available through PA Power Library under the particular record group that it happens to be noted. But again, not as much information as a federal that you can get from that. All right. So you had the list of names, you got the background, you searched the indexes, you have a list of names, you went through the pensions, eliminated what you could, or verified that, yes, this is my person. This is the person I'm really interested in. Now comes the actual service records. Now, a lot of these records are abstracted in the cards that we talked about, the Revolutionary War military abstract cards. and also in the Revolutionary War compiled service records for the federal government. A lot of the information is compiled in there. So you may ask, well, why do I need to look at the original records if they're abstracted in these cards and indexes? There's several reasons. And this goes not only for Revolutionary War research, but any kind of genealogical or historical research that you need to do. One, the indexes, you have human error that comes up. They may have transcribed the information wrong or accidentally left something out of those abstract cards. And I can tell you marginalia that appear on the records that convey information are not captured on those cards, either one, ours or the National Archives. There's a lot of marginalia that are just notes, checks, abbreviations that are very important to the veteran service that aren't captured in there. So those kind of human errors and things that are left off. There's also something to be said at looking at the records and filling in gaps, kind of the missing. Yeah, you found your ancestor on this record, but in the index, he doesn't appear on any others for that unit. Well, why is that? Well, you're not going to know unless you look at the records. If you go into these records, most of them are going to be arranged by unit. So you can go through and he may be noted in one record, and then the next roll, the next month, he's gone, and then he reappears the following month. Well, why? I don't know. That's something that you'd have to research. Or you find him in the index for one period of time, one record, and he's not found in anything else. Well, why is that the case? Well, if you go to the original records, you'll see that, oh, for that company or that unit, they only have that one record and they're missing a lot. So it's not that he was discharged, wounded, or left service. It's because the records don't exist anymore for that time period. And then we might have to look somewhere else to fill in that gap to establish his record. So there is value to looking at the original records beyond the abstract indexes that were looked at before. And the records themselves, the military service records, are going to be different based on the branch of service. Each branch created different types of records. There's overlap with the information, but they are slightly different. And there are some records that exist for some branches and not others. So starting out with the Continental Line, the bulk of the Continental Line records are part of the National Archives collection, and those are under the Revolutionary War rolls. So if you looked at their compiled service cards, they are going to be directing you to the Revolutionary War rolls. So if you find one of those, you're going to hop into the Revolutionary War rolls and take a look at that unit's records. They're arranged again by state and then by the unit. So they're not that difficult to get to or to browse. But you're going to hop in there. You're going to take a look at their muster rolls, payrolls, receipt rolls, returns, accounts, the various records that they have under that unit. Again, looking for your ancestor, and then looking where he's not appearing, looking for any marginalia, any additional details that may have been missed on the index cards, again, to try and create a better picture of what was going on. With luck, there's a lot of records for the unit, but there are plenty of units where the reason why you only find run reference is because there's simply very few records that still exist for that unit, that company, at that particular time that your ancestor served. The Revolutionary War rolls are on Ancestry, they're on Fold 3. You can get them on FamilySearch.org for free too. So you can browse them, take your time and look at those records and see what else you can find on your ancestor, or at least more detail in the unit that your ancestor served in. The Pennsylvania State Archives also has Continental Line unit records. It's much lighter on muster rolls and class rolls than the federal. Most of our records are going to be powers of attorneys and miscellaneous accounts with just a sprinkling of muster rolls, like kind of the muster rolls that you see in the image there. So it's really heavy on POAs, powers of attorneys, and accounts that you find in there, but that doesn't mean there isn't important information. So you definitely want to look through there. And it's doubly important for our collection of Pennsylvania Continental Line because when they did the cards, the Revolutionary War abstract cards, they didn't capture the information from the power of attorneys and the various accounts. They focus just on the roles and some of the rosters and lists that they had in there. So there's a lot of records that still exist in our Continental Line records that aren't necessarily captured in our Revolutionary War card index and abstract cards. So you want to look through there and again, go document by document through there to find whatever you can on the particular individual. I personally, for our Continental Line, I'll sit there and go through every single document if I'm looking for a person, and it's not a huge and burdensome task. It is quite capable of doing it, but going through simply because a lot of these power of attorneys and a lot of these accounts, it's under the name of whoever the document was for. So if it's a power of attorney for John Doe, it's going to be under his name and not under, the witness to it. Or if it's an account for a particular captain of the unit, but he may be noting other individuals on the document. So it might be under the captain's name and not under the individuals that are listed on the sheet. So you'd want to browse through those Continental Line units to see what else is there for an ancestor. Fortunately, these are available online through PA Power Library. You can get them through the under Comptroller General's office, Revolutionary War accounts for line. Now, unique to the Continental Line, and you're not going to find it with other branches of the service, maybe Rangers because they're kind of quasi Continental Line. You have depreciation and Pierce certificate accounts. For those that don't know exactly what depreciation and the Pierce accounts are, the depreciation certificates were issued to members of the Pennsylvania Continental Line, and other states did it too. But they were issued to veterans of the Continental Line for depreciation in their pay. Over the years, they were being paid in Continental certificates, Continental money, and the inflation was huge. So these depreciations were issued out by the states to compensate the veterans for that depreciation in the value of their pay. The certificates themselves, at least in our collection, don't really have tons of information that you typically look for, but they do have information that's valuable if you read between the lines. And what they really do is provide you approximation of how long they served, because these depreciations were issued up to basically August 1780, and really just before the January Mutiny in 1781 of the Pennsylvania Continental Line. So if your ancestor got a depreciation certificate that went from 1777 to 1780, then that would be a good indication of the time period that that individual served. And then they could have been furloughed after the mutiny, or they could have left slightly early. So it gives you clues. It doesn't state outright how long they served, but based on the amounts that they're paid and the time period covered, it gives you a clue as to the approximate time that they were part of the Continental Line and qualified for a depreciation certificate. Now, the depreciation certificates, you can find references to them in the Revolutionary War abstract cards and in the compiled service records. So the National Archives has some records, and we have some records for the depreciation certificates. We actually hold the original certificates, and the National Archives have what are known as numbered books, which is basically a register. And you can see the image that's in the background on this is one of those register books of depreciation certificates that were issued to individuals. What's nice about the numbered books for depreciation certificates is they do have entries in the margin. They kind of have remarks that sometimes note enlistment dates, or might note that they died, or might make note to a widow. So they have just various little notes that you can find in those registers. So you need to really search both. If you find a reference for the National Archives and their compiled records, or if you find it in our abstract cards, it's certainly worth a look to see the depreciation certificates. The Pierce certificates, those were issued, well, they're named after John Pierce, who was the Paymaster General, and basically handled the issuance of these certificates or was responsible for them. These certificates were issued for basically pay that was due to veterans that weren't paid at the time of that service. What's unique about the peer certificates and what makes them very important for Pennsylvania Continental Line veterans is they document service after the mutiny in January 1781. There's very few muster rolls and records, payrolls, receipt rolls, descriptive rolls that document units for the Pennsylvania Continental Line after the mutiny. The peer certificates are one record that does provide that detail. And what they tell us is that what dates that they were being paid for or being reimbursed for. So they might say this is pay from January 1781 to January 1782, or January 1782 to November 3rd, 1783. So it provides a record of that individual service beyond the furlough and discharge of most of the Pennsylvania Continental Line after the mutiny. What's also nice about it, and we have what's known as the payroll books for the peer certificates, and you can see it in the foreground image. This is for the artillery 4th Regiment. What's nice about these is, of course, it lists the name, it lists the date that the certificates were issued, and they're issued after the war. But what's nice about them is they do have signatures oftentimes. Now, what you hope is that it's the veteran themselves that are signing for the certificate to acknowledge receipt. That way you can compare signatures. If you have a signature of the ancestor from some non-military record, you can compare it to this register, this pay book, and see if they're the same signature or have the same mark. That's another way to verify that, yes, this is the right individual. This is my John Smith and not the other John Smith that was in the artillery. So it's a very good source of information, and they're indexed in our Revolutionary War military abstract cards. So again, it's something that's indexed, and I definitely would say bring up the volumes and take a look. And these Pierce volumes are on PA Power Library under the Comptroller General, just like the rest of the Revolutionary War records. So you can bring up those pay books and take a look if you find a reference in our index cards. Now, donation land is land that the state issued for service during the Revolutionary War, as opposed to the federal. The federal government did issue bounty land, but none of that federal land was located in Pennsylvania. It was all located Ohio and West. But the state itself issued donation land to veterans of the Pennsylvania Continental Line. And the key is veterans of the Continental Line who served to the end of the war. So if your ancestor served in the Continental Line and was discharged after the mutiny, he did not qualify for donation land. Militia also did not qualify for donation land. So this is specifically just to the Continental Line of Pennsylvania and specifically to those that served to the end of the war. They were the records themselves that we have, the donation land records, consist of basically I'd say miscellaneous papers. You have power of attorneys, you have deeds, you have some registers that list individuals that qualified and the fact that they got the land, and then you have surveys of the tracts that can be used. Now, all of these records are available online through our website, and we'll get to a page that has that. But the one thing I like to note is all of this donation land was located in Western Pennsylvania. And here's an image. All the kind of the light pink are the donation land tracts. There's basically 10 districts, and you can see the Roman numerals up along kind of the border of Pennsylvania and Ohio. Those are the donation districts, and the pink area are where those donation tracts were located. And it was only in those places that the donation land was located. We get a lot of people that say, hey, my ancestor served in the Revolutionary War and he got land in Northumberland County, or you got land in Berks County for service in the Revolutionary War. And that's just not the case. No land was issued out in those areas. It's only in these pink areas in Western Pennsylvania that the donation land was awarded for veterans of the Continental Line. But like I said, the records are all available online. You can get to it through our website. That's where it's located. You just go on our website under research guides and then land record indices, and then there'll be a link for donation land. I recommend when starting out, go into the registers. The registers, there's really one register with two sections in it. Both of them are just by the first letter of the surname, and then you can scroll through and see if an ancestor got any land. There is a way to identify exactly where the land was located within the particular district, that particular lot that they got. I would suggest contacting us. That can take a little bit of work to determine that, but it is possible to see where that land was ultimately located for the veteran. All right. Militia. The militia is by far the branch that most individuals served in. And there's several reasons for that. There's really two militia units, and I'll point this out first, because there's oftentimes a lot of confusion between it. One, militia is often referred to for the associators, and then a later period, the Pennsylvania militia. When I refer to militia, I'm largely referring to the Pennsylvania militia that was established in 1777. The associators is a volunteer militia that was formed right at the beginning of the war. There's not tons of records for those associator units. There are some in our collection and at the National Archives. There's some also at the Smithsonian has some. So there's kind of scattered around in different sources, but there's not tons of those records. And those units disappeared after the formation of the Pennsylvania militia in 1777. Now, the reason why most individuals served in the militia is because it was compulsory. After the militia law of 1777 was passed, all white males between the ages of 18 and 53 were required to be part of the militia. There was no exemption for religion. So that's where you can get Mennonites, Amish, any of the peace churches, they were still required to be part of it. There's very few exemptions that were allowed. And typically those are for, people that served in the General Assembly and in some civil offices, got some exemptions that existed. When a unit was formed, or way the militia was organized was basically every county had militia. So you have like Berks County militia, Lancaster County militia. Each county was divided up into districts, 8 districts. Those became battalions. So you have 8 battalions in a county. Every battalion or sub-district was divided up into sub-districts, which were companies. So they were divided up into 8 companies. And then each company, the men within that company were divided up into 8 classes. It's confusing. It's a very complex system they had set up. But militia service, they didn't serve all the time. It was draft based. So they would be drafted by their class. So when I say class, think of it as a draft class. It's not 100% accurate, but it's easy to get your brain wrapped around it. So when they needed the militia, they would draft a particular class from that militia to serve. And they would only serve 2 months or less by law. They weren't required to serve longer in any particular stint than 2 months. Typically, they only served a few weeks in most cases. Sometimes it was only a day. They were called up and then they were discharged after that. Another confusing part of the militia to keep in mind as we're getting into the militia records is because of this, how unique the organization was, you have what's known as permanent billet and active duty. Well, what does that mean? Well, when they organized the militia, when they divided up the county into 8 battalions, 8 companies within each battalion, and then each company was divided and classed out, those units that were created based on residence was considered your permanent billet. I like to call it your training battalion. It's in those units that you trained. You had to train 12 times a year. You do 6 in the spring, 6 in the fall. So you would train in that unit. When drafted for active duty, you'd be drafted by class on rotation. So you start with first class and you go to second class, third class to get the number of men needed. You draft by class. Those people would then be formed up into new active duty units, typically under different officers. Let's make it more confusing than it has to be. Um, and then they would go out and do their tour, however long that is, 2 months or less. And then that unit would be dissolved. Men would be discharged from that unit, and then they would just go right back to their training battalion and continue training until they're drafted again. And they could be drafted once in a year. They could be drafted twice in a year. It just depends on the amount of activity that's going. So the militia, very interesting. I love the militia. It's one place to spend a lot of time. But that's where most people serve, just because it was compulsory for men to serve. Now, what's nice about the militia, and which helps with identifying individuals, is the fact that it's based on residence. If your ancestor was living in a particular place, he would have been in that unit there. If he moved someplace else, he would then become part of that unit. If your person didn't move around at all, he should only be in that particular unit. And most of these units are based around where they resided, which is usually the township level. So if you know where your ancestor lived, again, here's that timeline. If you know that they lived in this particular township, in this particular county during the war, then I would expect them to be in a specific unit in that county that was established there for that time period. And we have a nice chart like you see here that's on our website. If you go into research guides, there's a whole thing for Revolutionary War by the counties. This is kind of an organizational chart which will say who the officers are. It's usually the colonels and the captains, and then what unit they're associated with, or the township that they're associated with. So, like the first company from 1777 to 1780 was the officer, the captain was Caspar Stover, and his unit was associated with Bethel Township. So if your ancestor was living in Bethel Township and was in this battalion, then that's your guy. Now, keep in mind, as you can see here, militia is a confusing mess. In 1780, they had new elections for officers, and they oftentimes changed the designations of the unit. So you can see here, under Lancaster County Revolution, they have the 1st Battalion, 1777. Well, after the elections for new officers in 1780, it became the 2nd Battalion, just to confuse the matter. But nothing changed. The people stayed where they are. It's just a unit designation that changed over time. But we have these lists on our webpage to kind of help figure that out. So for militia records, you looked in our index, you found reference to your ancestor. Where do you go from there? Well, the Pennsylvania State Archives has by far the largest collection of militia records, Pennsylvania militia records, than anywhere else. You can find scattered pieces in private collections, and there's some at the National Archives or some at Historical Society of Pennsylvania. But by and far, we have the bulk of the militia records. And so you're going to concentrate largely in our holdings, specifically the Revolutionary War accounts, associated and militia accounts that's in our collection. They're all on PA Power Library under Comptroller General. So again, you can go in and take a look. They're grouped by the county and then by the unit based on date. So you can go in there and browse. If you found an ancestor, you're going to want to browse all the records, and that's exactly what I do. If you send a request to me and your ancestor was part of the militia, or you believe is part of the militia, I identify the unit, and then I go into the records, starting with the battalion level, and I just look at every single document. I just flip through because they can be in any number of them, and there are a number of documents that could exist for the militia. So let's take a look at those. Class rolls. Those are one of the more common records that you're going to find for the Pennsylvania militia. A class roll is just a roster of the men in that particular company by class. So it lists what draft class they're in. So it's a record of all the men that were of age that were required to serve and what class they have been assigned to. These exist for most companies and most units. They used to do one in the spring and fall, sometimes more, but usually at least 1 or 2 exist for each company. So again, what you see here is not tons of information again, but unit, what class the person was in. It's very important later on to know what class in the unit. You can go and check our organizational chart to see what township they're associated with, again, to see if it's your guy living in the right place. We do have muster rolls. There are muster rolls for the militia, but few. There are few, and that's one issue that makes it difficult to trace what service an individual actually did in the militia, because there are few muster rolls. And the muster rolls are basically a record of active duty units that served. They'll tell you what company they were on, the date range that the service took place, oftentimes what the nature of the service was, how many days each person served, and oftentimes how much they were to be paid. You're looking at one here in the image. It can sometimes be difficult for people to differentiate between what's a class roll and what's a muster roll. The easiest way is to look for the column substitute. Anybody that served in the militia, they could always hire a substitute or provide a substitute to get out of active duty service. So a father can submit his son in his place, or you could pay someone to take your place for that tour, or you could just pay a substitute fine. And then the county lieutenant, who's the administrative, who has oversight over the militia, would use that to hire substitutes so that they have the required men. So if you see substitute on there, you're more than likely looking at a muster roll of people. And as you can see here, a lot of people hired substitutes or got substitutes to serve in their stead during the war. Fine lists are another major one. That's probably the most common militia record there is, simply because, as everybody knows with the state or any kind of government body, if they're owed money, they keep a good record of who owes them money. And the fine lists are all over the place. People were fined in the militia all the time for different things, most prominently for not attending training. As you can imagine, almost every militia person missed training at some point in time, simply because they were sick, or they had harvest, or someone in their family was ill and they had to miss training, so they were fined for that. They could be fined for not doing not showing up for rendezvous when mustered into active service. They can be fined for that. So most individuals were fined at least once or twice during the war. So there are a lot of fine lists, and most people are found in a couple of those fine lists. If you're lucky, the person was fined and they appealed, and the record of that appeal still exists. Of all the service records for the militia, the appeals records are the ones that can have the most identifying information and the most interesting information for an individual. So everyone under law had right to appeal whatever fine that they were assessed, to either lessen it or be exempted from paying that fine. And the excuses are all over the place. As you can imagine, most of them are I'm sick or injured, or family members are ill, or something along to that effect, to get out of service. But you can also find a record of a person's birth or death, and they're saying, hey, I'm too old or I'm too young to be in the militia. You know, I'm younger than 18, I'm older than 53, I shouldn't be part of it. So you can get dates of birth for individuals on there. You can even get parents' names sometimes in the appeals, as the parents would appeal for their minor child. You can also just get interesting story. If you want to read anything, I enjoy more than anything else reading some of these appeals, especially when they actually have the appeal books and they include a lot of detail. The one image in the foreground, there's three names there, but the bottom one is basically a Richard Nagel. I like his because basically he's appealing. He was fined for not showing up for muster, and he was fined for not doing that. And his excuse was he was basically taken by the British, and then he was forced to be part of the British Army and served in the British Army. And then he deserted the British Army. And he was saying, since I served, technically, I should be exempted for all that he went through in the British Army. Now, he was granted an exemption from having to pay the fine, but they made clear in that exemption that it wasn't because he served as part of the British against us, but it was because he was too poor. He was too poor to pay, so we exempted him from having to pay. I've seen ones on there where the person claimed that he only spoke Gaelic and so could not serve because he wouldn't understand, or no one would be able to understand him. So you get some very interesting comments in the appeals book, if you're fortunate enough that it still exists for that particular unit or battalion. Another major record that you're going to find with the Pennsylvania militia is the militia loan certificates. These were issued out to pay militiamen, largely militiamen, for service after the war, for service that was rendered during the war. Again, it was another IOU because they didn't have money to pay all the men that served in the militia. The militia loan certificates can have a good amount of information. They are indexed in the Revolutionary War military abstract cards in our collection. The only problem is that the abstract card only has basic information about the county and the amount being paid. It usually doesn't say anything about what the nature of the service or data service is. That said, you can figure it out. There are records that you can use to figure out exactly what the nature of the service was and the date range for more than 50% of the cases. But it is very complex, and that's something that you would certainly reach out. You could reach out to me or contact the archives, and we can certainly try and provide guidance, or you can send in a request and we can take a look and see and do the research. It is possible. The records are online, PA Power Library, so you could do it, but it is complex. You're jumping from record to record to do that. But it may be worth it in some cases. And I can tell you this straight out, if your ancestor was from York County and got a militia loan certificate, it's for service at camp security for garrison duty. That's almost all the York County militia that served at camp security got a militia loan certificate. So, and the background image there is one of the receipt books for service at camp security. And what's nice about these receipt books, if they exist for the particular battalion or county, is it'll have signatures on it too. Again, you can use that to identify your individual. There. All right. Pennsylvania Navy. We'll go really quick through Pennsylvania Navy. Yes, Pennsylvania had its own Navy, very short-lived Navy. The reason why is because during the Philadelphia campaign, they basically sunk or set their ships on fire to try and prevent the British from coming up the Delaware. It didn't really work. So they destroyed most of their ships. So 1776 to really 1777, although some records, there's a few ships that still existed afterwards that there's records of. We have them in our collection. They are indexed in the military abstract cards. And the records themselves are just grouped by ship under the ship name. And can be browsed on PA Power Library, again, under the Comptroller Generals. As opposed to the militia records, the Navy, they tend to have a little bit more in there. If you're doing research on African Americans or slaves that could have served, a number, I should say, did serve in all branches. Unfortunately, it's usually difficult, like for militia and stuff, to identify them because they usually don't know race or status. But in the Pennsylvania Navy records, they often do. And if it was a slave that served, they often note the master or owner of that slave who served in that particular ship or on that particular ship at a given time. Sometimes they even have notes as to tattoos on there too, which is pretty interesting in our collection. Continental Navy, I'll go even faster through because so few people, especially from Pennsylvania, served in the Continental Navy. There are records. Again, the Revolutionary War compiled service records for the National Archives. That's a place to look. They're combined with the Continental line records too. So you can take a look at those, see if you can find an ancestor within those records for the Navy. We don't hold any Continental Navy records in our collection. So it'd really be the National Archives. Take a look and see if you can find any records there. All right. So where to go from here? All right. So you looked at the records, you identify your individual, you went through the original militia records and the military records you got all of that information. How do I put meat on the bone? How do I put context to their service? That's one thing that we always get asked a lot about is how do I document the service? What did they do during their time? And depending on the branch, it's an easier answer than another branch. But what I suggest is after you get all those records, hit the published sources. If you're Continental Line, there are a lot of published sources that you could use to kind of get more details about what that Continental Line unit or those units were doing at the time. Probably the number one for Pennsylvania Continental Line would be Trussell's, the Pennsylvania Line Regimental Organization and Operation, and that will be noted in the handout, but I have it on the side here too. That provides a kind of an organizational history of each of the units and then an operational history saying what they're doing, where they're going. It has a list of what companies were at what battles, casualties. It has a wealth of information that you can use to track your Continental Line, PA Continental Line member. And there's other books like The Continental Army by Robert Wright that provides details as to how the Continental Army was organized and how it operated. So you get some of that more context of what was going on. There's just a myriad of things. Proper Sense of Honor by Catherine Cox that provides details as to kind of the life of a Continental Line officer, Continental Line soldier. And then you have, published sources on various battles that the Continental Line were involved in. I mean, you have David McCullough here, 1776. There's tons written on Trenton, Princetown, Saratoga, all kinds of battles. There's usually a book on it that covers, operations, um, uh, order of battle, and everything like that that you can use to again thresh out more information about the service that or what your ancestor likely did at the time. Unfortunately for the militia, there's really nothing like that. There's very little. You have Hannah Roach's The Pennsylvania Militia in 1777, which covers kind of the Philadelphia campaign. She goes over the organization of the militia and then tries to document as best as possible the counties and the classes that were called up during that campaign and what they did and where they were. But it's very difficult with the militia because of lack of record and the fact that the complexity of how the militia was organized, how it was called up, and people were drafted. As the war went on, it got to be a mess. And it's very hard to track. And the fact of the matter, if your ancestor was part of the militia and it said that they mustered or served, that doesn't mean they technically went out on active service. I have found that if it says mustered or served, that person could have supplied a substitute or paid a substitute fine. And by doing that, they met the legal definition of what to serve meant. So they'd be checked off as having served because they met their legal obligation. So it gets very tricky with militia. But if you're dealing with it, what I would say is learn about the history of the county as best you can and what was going on at the county at a particular time. That will give some context as to their service. And you could look at various accounts in government records, and this is specifically true for the militia. You can look at Supreme Executive Council minutes and correspondence for Pennsylvania. That's where the orders were coming out for drafts. They're reaching out to the county. They were contacting the lieutenants and sub-lieutenants, the civil administrators for the militia. And from their correspondence or minutes, you can get a sense of what was going on. And you could also take a look at the county lieutenant, sub-lieutenant accounts. Those are part of the Revolutionary War accounts with the militia records in our collection. You can see what's there. Again, largely just accounts, receipts, but those receipts can provide additional information. They could say paid Captain so-and-so for, calling up this particular class, or paid Captain so-and-so for marching his men over Blue Mountain or something along that. So you can start kind of developing a story around what was going on at the county and what that unit may have seen or done, or your ancestor may have been marched out to and done. So you'd keep on building on those various records and published sources to kind of put together a story of what your ancestor did during that time frame. I know that was a lot and I went fast. But any questions? I'm here for you. I can answer as many questions as possible.
Looks like we have a question here from Jim Seagrieve Daily. Just says thanks for all the information. If DAR or SAR confirms, would that be considered the best available information about the relative's service?
Um, it depends. Now DAR and SAR are really going back through the old application, so they're putting a freeze on a lot of the lines. So if this is a line that was frozen and has been opened up again, and you're going off of that particular individual's line or ancestor, then yes, there's a lot more now, more recent ones that yes, I would say that would be a pretty good um, record or information on the service of the individual, at least the basics. Now, if you're going off an old application that maybe hasn't been closed, but no one has tried to go in through that particular application or that line, um, then I would question it a bit more. What I would do is take a look at the DAR and SAR and see if you can get access to the applications to see the detail, what sources they're citing. If they're citing the Pennsylvania archives and only the Pennsylvania archives, I wouldn't rely, or published Pennsylvania archives, I should say, published Pennsylvania archives. I wouldn't rely too much on that. I would do more work. And I have to tell you this, with DAR, um, a lot of individuals that appear in 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 their records or pop up, uh, they oftentimes use what are known as supply tax lists to get their ancestors into DAR. So I'd certainly check to see if that is the source. Um, the supply tax was basically a state tax that was paid, whose proceeds were used to help fund not only the state, but also help provide funds for supporting the Pennsylvania Continental Line. So that is considered giving material support to the Patriots. So you can get into DAR that way. If that's the case, if they got into supply, then that's not really militia service or any type of actual military service. That's just a payment of a tax. And I wouldn't rely on that. Um, but certainly DAR and SAR applications are a good place to start. Personally, I like to always verify information as much as possible. So I would just check their sources, and you can certainly expand on their application. A lot of them will find maybe a class role and then use that to get in, but there could be other records related to the individual that might exist that could provide a little bit more information. So good place to start, but I would check the sources and then see if I can expand on it.
Just a just a few comments.
Mhm.
Um, Jody says that she has more resources now, and she has two ancestors that were in the Revolutionary War, and one served at Brandywine. Jim says that he has an ancestor that was wounded at Brandywine and continued to serve at Germantown, and as part of the Radnor picket when the army was in Valley Forge.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, it can be. It's always interesting looking at some of these records and actually, like I said, you get the military service records for the individual, the actual service records, and then read the actual published books that a lot of these scholars have done to really thresh out the details, and then try and see if you can fit those together. They are wonderful stories. I mean, there's a lot of reports of like at Brandywine with the militia. They were oftentimes the militia was stuck on the flanks or held in reserve. And then it's just it's funny some of the reports where there's certainly skirmishes as each side filled out the flanks to see if they could outflank the other side, and they'll have reports that this line began in a skirmish, they fired and ran or something like that. There's some great reports out there. So like I said, there's a lot of published sources that you could take a look at and just get that extra detail that's floating around for those conflicts.
I have a question for you, and
Sure.
Aaron. So I found a few abstract cards, and it
Mhm.
said inactive duty militia.
Yes.
What does that mean?
I don't like those on there. I don't know whose idea it was to put inactive and active service on there. Basically, on the cards, the purpose is to distinguish whether that is an inactive, which in most cases just means that is a what we're referring to as a permanent billet record or a training battalion record. Um, And the active would be like a muster roll or some type of pay that is clearly associated with active duty service with an active duty unit. The problem I have with that is not so much the active duty, because they'll say like militia loan certificate. Yeah, that's clearly for active duty unit. They're being paid for some active service that they're doing. My issue is with the inactive, because they're basing it on the record, but the records have marginalia and notes on it that sometimes point to the fact that, oh yeah, they could have done active service, and this is a record that they're doing active service. And that might be the only record that exists, let's say, for that unit and that person. And they look at that and say, oh, well, it's inactive. He didn't do any service. And I'll look at that document and say, well, no, they're noted there as on tour. Well, he's on tour. So it's some type of, he's being recognized at least for having met his legal obligation. So is it an inactive record? Yes, it's a class roll, but there's marginalia there that points to some type of active service. But that's what it is. It's just distinguishing between the types of records that there is. It's either the permanent billet fine list or a class roll versus a muster roll or an actual pay receipt related to active service. But yeah, I don't think that was needed to be on there.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
I think it's silent.
Okay,
All
yeah,
right.
I guess not. So with that, I just want to say thanks, Aaron, and thanks
No
all of
problem.
you for joining us today. Our Revolutionary Speaker Series will be on hiatus until the fall. In the meantime, please visit our website, brandywinebattlefield.org, for information on upcoming events and how you can support Brandywine Battlefield Park. Thank you all again, and a lot of other people are saying thank you, Aaron. So,
No problem. Yep, and my contact is on the handout. You can always send me a question if you think of one later on.
all right.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
All
I
right. Thanks for
appreciate it.
having me.
Yeah.
Yep. All right.
Take
Take care.
care.
Bye bye.
Bye.